Shalom, shalom. First, I want to start off by giving all honor, praises, and infinite glory unto Yahweh, Bahashem, Yahweh Shai, Bahashem, Rakakwadash. I want to give double honors unto the elders, apostles, and bishops of GMS Great Millstone who rule well, teach, and edify in peace and blessings. To sincere Akim, well, Akwat in the house of faith. My name is Yeshaya, and I wanted to, Lord willing, Baratazah, do an edifying video going into the topic that masters, a master of things are just those who tried the most and tried their hardest just as much. And I don't say, try their hardest, because ultimately, man, you're going to have bad days and you're going to have good days, man. But the whole, the name of the game, is it's you versus you. How many times are you going to go up and do the things that are uncomfortable? And that's the thing that Yahweh Bashem Yahweh Shai is expressing, here in this captivity, especially in these times, man, when you got things popping off left and right. But folly, is at a very high, man. And with that being said, a master of something are those that tried the most. Those that just kept on doing and kept on doing. And I wanted to make a point too through the Spirit is that, the Lord will gift a man to be a master of something quickly. That's why some boxers start at 25, 23, but some have been at it since 7 years old, But, that's the thing about being in his faith is that the Lord will give that to some men, but then other men, he'll take longer for that, because at the end of the day, there has to be, teachers, man. There has to be followers, and there has to be, helpers. There's a whole body in which Yahweh Bashem Yahweh Shai has established here in this earth. And with that being said, you see rappers, athletes, politicians, you see a lot of these people who've been given a gift, whether it's a politician with his ability to speak, whether it's a, rapper with his ability to portray images, make something sound cool, whether it's an athlete on his ability, to get the W. When do you ever see them exalting Yahweh Bashem Yahweh Shai? Never. And also, even on a lower level, when do you ever see them thanking their parents for the positions that they're in? Because I know growing up where I grew up at, I went to high school at, there's a lot of D1, football players, like 20 to 30 every senior class, maybe a little less than that, a little more. And a lot of their parents are ex-NFL players, and they do a whole lot when it comes to paying for their training. So they're able to get ahead of the curve, and they don't give credit to their parents, man. And I say that to say this, that Yahweh Bashem Yahweh within us the right spirit, the correct spirit. And now it's our job to exercise that which we've been given. And now this is 1 Corinthians, or is it 2 Corinthians? I think it's 2 Corinthians 9. Nope. 1 Corinthians 9. And I'm going to start at verse 24. Because this is ultimately, man, the condition of what we're facing here in Babylon the Great, man. And it says, just in the KJV, it says, know ye not that they which run in a race run all, but one receiveth the prize, so run that ye may obtain. That's your intention. Your intention, that's your integrity. That's you continuing to run even when it hurts, even when you don't feel like it, even when you fall down, you get back up and you don't quit the race. That's the thing. Even if you have to walk or crawl a few steps, man, crawl those steps, walk those steps, because at the end of the day, man, the scriptures say, he that endureth to the end, the same shall be saved. Not he that endureth, 2-3 years and then fall out, can expect that salvation. No. That's not what the Lord said. That's not what the Lord ordained. Because at the end of the day, we are the Lord's. At the end of the day, our lives are denoted to Yahweh Bashem Yahweh Shai. And ever since you came into this faith, ever since that you accepted being, following these laws, statutes, and commandments, ever since you accepted putting your hand to the plow, you've therefore forfeit your life here in Babylon the Great. And now your life is an entire life of sacrifice. Every day, every minute of each day, we need to be trying our best to sacrifice our living body to Yahweh Ba'Shem Yahushai, and we do that by hearkening unto the Lord, abiding by his laws, statutes, and commandments to the best of our ability, by getting in the word, by listening to, videos, man, of the 100% sound doctrine, because back in the day they had letters. Apostle Paul wrote to the churches letters. Now in modern day, we have virtual epistles, being the fact that this truth has been spread all throughout the four corners of the earth via the internet. So, we have to stay locked into these lifelines that we've been given, because at the end of the day, if all these things were to be relinquished from you right now, how would you feel? You will be fighting tooth and nail to try to get them all back. Don't be like Jake, where you have to lose something to understand how valuable it was. That's the thing, man. That's why it says, remember thy first love, as the scriptures say, man. I'm not going to get all these precepts because I'm doing it in transit. So I'm trying to be wise. The Spirit hit me, but, remember thy first love, man. Thy first love is that, woman, which is wisdom. Sophia, or as chachma in the Ibaria, the Hebrew. Chachma. A quick prayer you could say in the Hebrew, the Lashawan Kodash, which the Lord has established within us here in Babylon the Great, in our captivity, which is our pure language. It says, Babu Koshai, nothing like Yah, so please give me, Charachak Kodash Shal, the Holy Spirit, into Chachma, into wisdom, or just Babu Koshai, nothing like Yah, Chachma. So please give me wisdom, to make it simpler. Because that's the thing, man. We have to constantly be praying. That's a part of the sacrifice as well, to have the Lord within your mind, to be praying. We have to be obsessed with Yahweh Ba'Shem Yahushai. And that's how a master is able to master a thing. That's how you're able to grow your faith, through the mastery of the works of Yahweh Ba'Shem Yahushai. Because at the end of the day, the Lord has given us tools and resources, and he's established a spirit within us to be able to exercise all these things. And if you choose not to do it because you want to do something else, or if you want to sacrifice to something else, then that's your doom. Because, what you say yes to is also what you say no to. When you're saying yes to the flesh, but you're saying no to the Lord, there has to be a balance within you doing that. Because at the end of the day, Babylon the Great is an entire fleshly desire. Most of this shit is gonna, most of the stuff is inexpedient, and the vast majority of it is wicked, man. There's not very many things that you can truly enjoy here in Babylon the Great. That's why you see a lot of brothers getting into martial arts, into music, into, private music. We ain't out here trying to be the next rappers and come up singers, the next Hebrew Israelite, hip hop star. That's some dumbass shit, man. That's why you see brothers getting into these more meek and humble hobbies, that are able to help them balance the flesh and that are still fun. But, the Babylon the Great has, ultimately portrayed a vision of vanities and things that ultimately languish the spirit and get you away from the Lord. Things that'll actually, offend the spirit. Babylon the Great is an entire cesspool of tools to offend the spirit. And the Lord has given us these scriptures and the men of the Lord to how to please the spirit. So when you're making decisions, you got to think about, what it is that you're trying to please. Because simultaneously, the thing that you're trying to please can also be the thing that's going to offend the other spirit. You can grieve the enemy. As the scriptures say, I got to get that real quick. This is Sirach chapter 30 and verse 1. Because this is a position that we're put in whenever we choose that decision. Sirach 30 and verse 1 reads, okay, hold up, Salak, bear with me. 30 and verse 1, that reads, it says, he that loveth his son causeth him oft to feel the rod, that he may have joy on him in the end. It says, he that chasteneth his son shall have joy in him, and shall rejoice of him among his acquaintances. And he that teacheth his son grieveth the enemy, and before his friends he shall rejoice of him. And Yahweh Shai called his elect, his friends, man. When you being chastened in the Lord, when you getting these ass whoopings that ultimately strengthen you, you're grieving the enemy by staying and holding tight to Yahweh Ba'Shem Yahushai. But on the other hand, if you get in these chastisements and you start blaming the Lord and you start getting this sour, mopey, gropey ass, just keeping it real, a weak spirit, man. You fall into that weak spirit, you're gonna grieve the spirit of Yahweh Ba'Shem Yahushai, because the spirit of the Lord is strength. The spirit of the Lord is a spirit of prophecy, and the Lord has said to us, man, that he's got our backs in so many different scriptures, all through Isaiah, Baruch, all through Psalms, all through the entire book, which he has given us. He has established a testimony that he will come through for us, and have mercy upon us, and he will have your back in a time of trouble. You know, it doesn't matter what it is that you're battling right now. That is a battle. That isn't your life. That is a battle that you're dealing with in your life. And if you cannot girt the fuck up as a man and you let that thing destroy you, you know, you're ultimately a part of that cowardly group that ultimately was never, you know, a part of that number in the first place, man. You know, and lo and behold, there's been a lot of men, you know, this year that fell out. And you read in the scriptures, there's men that, you know, that the spirit, that weak spirit fell upon them, but they ultimately had to gird up out of it. Look at Jeremiah. You know, the Lord said, gird up thy loins as a man, I will be with thee, man. In Jeremiah 1:17, I believe. Look at Samson. He fell, you know, he got real tender, fell weak to a woman. But what did he do? He girded up and he repented and he prayed to the Lord, like, let me bring all this down, and boom, that whole thing toppled down, man. You know, that's the thing. Yahweh B'Shem Yahushai, his spirit is ultimately a spirit of courage. You know, his spirit is a spirit of victory. You know, and the fact that each, you know, Lord willing, we be a part of that number, that, you know, brothers that follow Yahweh B'Shem Yahushai and you Aqua too have been given that conqueror spirit, man. I don't know if you ever seen that anime. You know, you brothers and sisters out there have seen that anime One Piece, the Conqueror's Haki. You know, the spirit and power of Yahweh B'Shem Yahushai is that conqueror spirit. You know, it is that spirit that allows us to get through things even though it looks like it's dire and ugly. You know, and what the Lord is doing now, he's establishing our faith. You know, he's showing you what you're made of. Because coming from the backgrounds we all came from, we ain't thought of ourselves as nothing but a bunch of niggas, spics, and, you know, Indians. But now it's been established that we are actually the children of the true creator of this whole earth. The true power of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Yahweh B'Shem Yahushua. We're the true children of the Lord. You know, whether you be on the right or the left-hand side of that, you know, ultimately, you know, you come into this truth. Many are called, few are chosen. And those that are falling away are those, you know, that just couldn't, you know, get that grip, man. The apostles talk about it a lot. You know, Salakia for the rant, but, you know, the apostles talk about it for a lot, man. You know, a lot of guys that fall away just can't see themselves in that position. You know, and you can tie that also to a man being too washed into this society, man. You know, a lot of the things that you think and a lot of the things that you feel are ultimately tied at a root cause to something else, which is generally the world. You know, because ultimately righteous roots are always going to bear you the best fruits. And whenever you feeling as though that something's conflicting you and it's, you know, something that may be very well self-inflicted, which is a work of the lust, is oftentimes tied to the world. Men overcompensate with women because of their lack of purpose. You know, men overcompensate with, you know, trying to show out because of their lack of self-confidence. You know, men will try to drink more to escape their reality that they've been running away from. So at the end of the day, you have to recognize what your roots are. And all of us, you know, Salakia, but me as a young brother, humbly speaking, you know, I have worldly roots, and what the Lord is doing is he's extinguishing those. He's burning them off one by one, and that you know, that's a painful process. You know, I can attest it's a very painful process, and things that you are going to deal with are going to be things that you never thought you would deal with, and they're going to be things that you really want to dodge. But at the end of the day, we are sent here on a mission. We're not sent here for how we feel. If we're sent here for how we feel, we'll be here fucking forever, okay? You know, and we've understood that here in the scriptures. When they try to cross over into Egypt, I gotta refresh on the story, but it took them. It should have been a 3-day trip, but it took them 40 years. You know, that's Jake for you, man. You know, you take a whole family of Jake to a restaurant. You know, it's gonna take a minute to order, man. You know, simple things like that. You know, it's kind of funny, but it's very real, man. It's very real. Our people are sottish, they're backsliding, and they're just stupid, you know, ourselves included at one point in time, being the fact that we were all in that dead state. But finishing off the 1 Corinthians, the 9th chapter, you know, close this in transit lesson out. This is verse 25. It says, and every man that striveth for the mastery is temperate. You know, to be temperate, you know, is to be balanced. You know, understanding the condition of this battle, understanding that if you're striving for mastery, you cannot give up. If you're trying to master something, you have to keep on doing it. And you have to expend your resources to be able to do it. You see Jake out there in like Puerto Rico and the Dominican Republic, out there catching baseballs with cardboard. That's fucking commitment, man. Though that's the type of spirit that we gotta have. Whatever, as long as you got a Bible, and shoot, and you got access to the internet in one way, shape, or form, man, you got the secret recipe, man. And you got the spirit of Yahweh Bashem Yahushua Salaki. That's first and foremost. You got the spirit of the Lord, you got these scriptures, and you got these videos, man. You got the secret recipe. And I say secret because the rest of the world hasn't gotten that. Now, what it is that you do with that, ultimately is going to show who you are towards the Lord, man. Are you a man of the Lord? Or are you just kind of like, I'm an Israelite, one of those? And I say this humbly, because I've had people in my personal life at one point had that and they threw it away, and a lot of those things were tied. That's why at the beginning of the video, the Spirit made mention of how a person could be gifted something, but they don't, thank that which it, gave it to them. I've seen the Spirit taken off of somebody very close to me, in my personal family, man. And at one point calling on the name of the Lord, at one point, going in, but then at the next point, fell into that apostate, real bugged out spirit, man. And Lord forbid, that happens to us, man. That's the most fearful thing, to die through the Spirit is to truly die, man. But this is verse 25 again. It says, and every man that striveth for mastery is temperate in all things. Now they do it to obtain a corruptible crown, but we an incorruptible. So that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to stock up that spiritual stock, man. The things that you do here are actually playing true, meanings in heavenly councils. There's a report that's given about you every second of every day in the kingdom of Yahweh Bashem Yahushai. This man did this and this man did that. This is good, that's bad. Shoot, you never know. Like some of the things that you could be doing that are good unto the Lord could be increasing the things that you get in the kingdom. Could be increasing, certain things that the Lord wants to bless you with. You a brother that's been struggling with the woman here on this side, and you do something righteous, and you stand firm for this truth, the Lord might give you 10,000 of your favorite women. You never know, man. The Lord's great. The Lord's wonderful, and the Lord is truly working a thing in each and every, one of His followers. Chiefly His elect, man. And we have to stay locked into that spirit, as the hopeful elect, because we don't know if we made it, man. The apostles go into that a lot. It says, I therefore so run, not as uncertainly, so fight I, not as one that beateth the air. So you have an intention and you have a drive and you have a true, real motivation behind what it is that you're doing. Because we're not in this faith to play around. We're not in this faith to seem like these super deep, great men. We're not in this faith, to try to make it about ourselves or about, vainglory. We're simply doing the work of Yahweh Bashem Yahushai, because this is His ministry after all. It says, but I keep under my body and bring it into subjection, lest that by any means, when I have preached to others, I myself should be a castaway. And keeping under your body is what we've been, through the Spirit speaking on in the video, man. Making those decisions, those right from wrongs, doing the right things, and we are ultimately judged by the things that we do in our body. We're blessed, and the Lord will spare mercy upon the work that we do for Him. And you giving your body as a living sacrifice is a legitimate thing that we have to do here. There's a physicality to it. When you're burning, when you're, sitting here, wanting to do certain things, and for a fact that you can't, and you rebuke that spirit, that is you giving your body as a living sacrifice. You're putting your body up on the altar, and you're burning it, with the word. You're cutting it up and burning it with the word. And the Lord finds pleasure within that, man. We don't do animal sacrifice, but our sacrifice is very spiritual now. You're literally killing your flesh every time you make a good decision towards Yahweh Bashem Yahushai. And you're ultimately making that spirit rule, stronger over it. Because in the world, you build up your flesh. You make your flesh stronger and stronger. And when you first come into this faith, your flesh is strong as a mug. And the elder brother Tazabah said, a couple weeks ago at camp, those first few years of you being in the faith are the most pivotal years. And that's 100% fact. And I will, I believe that, wholeheartedly. Those are the years that really determine, your integrity. Those are the years that's like, okay, the Lord's really going to test you and wring you out those years, man. And ultimately, he keeps doing it, until we dead, dead or delivered. But I pray this lesson was edifying, like an impromptu, in transit lesson, you know. Hopefully it was well said and was edifying. I want to lastly give all honor, praises, and infinite glory to Yahweh, Ba'ashem Yahushua, Ba'ashem Rakakodash, Shalom.